And here's one of those big logs that I mentioned. This is me. I'm a little over 6 feet tall. So, and you know, these are children with me mostly, but if you look at the tree that's down there, that's the clusters along the way here. Um, and so this is a unique one. We don't really know much about its edibility because it's no one has ever found it like in situations where they were not like, oh my God, I've been pulling them off the trees to eat. Seems pretty tough. But just letting you know it's out there. And then, so this is another Hericium that's, you know, a standard edible. This is Hericium erinaceus, where erinace means a hedgehog. So like a hedgehog was wearing a cape or something. And you see it's one sort of solid mass. There are also various names for this, like the lion's mane or the goat's beard or things like that. But it's, you know, it's one solid clump of spines, and you can see the spines are pretty. Yeah. If we go back to the first one, these, you know, these spines are only a few inches long, um, or an inch or two long. But the goat's beard, it has this solid long spines. And then our other, here it is in color. And then our other thing is the branching Hericium, Hericium ramosum. And this is, you know, as you can see, it has lots of branches. There's a similar one on conifers in the Hericium coralloides, but this is, whoops, this is Hericium ramosum. And it's quite small. You can maybe, this isn't a big mushroom, it's just a few inches across here. But, you know, whenever you see a mushroom have this kind of very complicated surface, whether it's spines, whether it's these teeth, or whether it's pores or gills, you know that that's where the mushroom is producing its spores. And that way to narrow down what it might be. Now let me, do I have any questions here? Do I? Are we all good? So I thought I would start off with that because people have been reporting it in Westchester over the past couple weeks. And I understand you've got snow now, so that should put a damper on things on that one for a while. But I also thought I'd spend some time on some other mushrooms that are fairly well known for coming out in the snow. And one of these is actually called the winter mushroom, sometimes called the Christmas mushroom. And we are going to, okay. So as you can see, I name of this mushroom and snow, and voila. It's another thing. It comes out during the winter. It doesn't need a thaw. though it will come out during a thaw in its more sort of natural, in its more natural state here. Now, you can see it's got this warm sort of biscuity color on top. You can start to see here that the stem is a bit, take a closer look at this. This is the first nature site. And one of the common names for this is velvet shank, because the stem is covered with this, and the stem is very tough. And these two ways are a handy way to narrow down if you found it or not. It's very pretty. It's also a bit slimy on top. This is not my favorite eating mushroom. It has a taste that's kind of like peas, or like a cross between peas and celery, which you may like. I'm not terribly excited by it. And when they grow it commercially, they grow it in jars so that it stretches out trying to reach the light to the outdoors. And they grow it in darkness, so it comes out all white, and it's called enoki mushrooms, or enokitaki. Let me back up just a second. Mushrooms are in the same super kingdom with animals. You know, they eat external things. They don't photosynthesize. They have respiration that works kind of like ours. So if you're a mushroom that comes out on wood, you come out on trees, there's always a chance that you're going to come out inside the tree. In which case it would not be a good idea to release your spores, because then the spores will just fertilize the same tree that, you know, you just grew out of. So when they breathe, they can tell how much CO2 is in the air. And if they're in an enclosed space, the CO2 builds up just as it would for us, and they just keep growing stem to try and get out of that internal cavity where they think they are. So that's why these commercial enokis end up growing this long stem. They're grown in these long glass bottles, so there's not much air getting in, and they grow this long stem to try and get out, and so they can fulfill their biological destiny and release their spores. And which also means that they don't bother to make a cap, much of a cap, because why bother making a cap if you're not going to release spores? So that's what they look like commercially. They look completely different because they're grown in darkness and they're grown in these bottles. But when you find them in the woods, they look really lovely, and I think they have a lot more flavor. But also the stem is very tough and can't be eaten in that commercial version. So again, they have this lovely yellow-brown cap, which is a little bit of slimy. They have this very tough black furry, dark brown, black furry stem. And this is how you know them. And did I mention that they're slimy on top? And these can come out, you know, anytime during the winter, including when there's snow. I have a nice little hard copy photo in my closet somewhere of them coming up in my backyard. It has this nice little dome of snow on top of it because they pushed it up when they came up, and it's very adorable. And they are just, you know, an adorable mushroom in general. So this is just another a fun thing to look out for. Do we have any questions here? Okay. Nod, you can just yell at me. Another mushroom that doesn't really come out in winter, but you can find it in winter, is oyster mushrooms. And again, if you Google the scientific name and the word snow, you get a whole bonanza of pictures of oyster mushrooms with snow on them. And you know, one of the finds when I was first mushroom hunting with my dad, and which he still loves to tell the story of, is on New Year's Day, about 35 years ago. We were visiting friends for New Year's, and when we drove up to their house, it's like 10, 11 o'clock at night, our head tree with an oyster mushroom on it that was about a foot across. And so we were like, oh, I guess we have something to do on New Year's Day here. And so we collected it, and my father had a great deal of fun asking her, well, you know, what would you do if you saw someone going around with a flashlight in your yard at midnight? But we came back on the next day, knocked on the door, our friend introduced us, said, hey, can we go collect that oyster mushroom in your backyard? And she was like, fine. And the thing had frozen solid on the tree. So I actually had to pick up a fairly big rock and knock it off with the rock. And then we took it home and thawed it and cooked it up and had ourselves a little New Year's Day party. So this is what happens with the oyster mushrooms. They'll come out when there's a thaw, they'll come out before it's freezing, and then they'll just freeze solid on the tree. And they'll persist like that. And again, you know, when the weather lightens up, when they, you know, when the moisture starts flowing again, they'll start sporulating again and doing their thing. And on we go. So this is another good one to look out for. And let's see. Let me switch gears a little bit. So sort of going back to the tooth fund, the Hericium thing. This, come on. Okay. So this is the sort of thing that we often call a coral fungus. A coral. And as you can see, these are logs. They're growing on wood. And this shows one of the problems with classifying mushrooms by their sort of general shape, because we have a category of mushroom that we call tooth fungi, and you just saw a bunch of them. And they were white, and they looked like these icicles on the wood. And we also have things that are called coral mushrooms, and they look kind of like this, though they're usually more colored. But actually, this particular, quote, coral mushroom, unquote, is actually basically an upside down Hericium. It's the same as those icicle mushrooms you saw before, but it's growing up instead of down from the wood. So it's got the same spore-bearing strategy. It makes all these branches and produces spores on them. This one is called the crowned coral. I don't, let's go to Michael. This is the Messiah College website. If you have any fungus on wood, mushroom, and the word Messiah, and it'll bring you to this website. Here we go. So this is called the crowned coral because the branches have these sort of multiple fingers at the ends of the branches, and the idea was that they look like a bit like crowns. And I think Michael Kuo on the mushroom expert site, yeah, he has a close-up of these here. So, and like I mentioned, these are eating the wood, like the Hericium that we looked at originally. Most coral mushrooms are in the genus Ramaria. They're a bit thicker, they're fleshier, and they are what we call mycorrhizal. They're symbiotic with the trees around them. It is sometimes confused with the crowned coral that I just showed you. It is like all Ramarias, it's going underground, it's hooking onto the roots of trees, they are feeding each other. The fungus is finding water and minerals for the tree is sending sugars to the mushroom. And but this one is called Ramaria stricta, and for some reason it actually grows up through wood and produces its mushrooms on wood, on these little logs. And it's also kind of straight up and down, which makes it look a bit like the Artemisia that we just looked at. But usually it's quite a bit browner than the Artemisia. The crowned coral, don't do that. Okay. The crowned coral is really white, and when it gets older, it goes yellow. But Ramaria stricta has this brown tint to it, and the branches are just kind of fleshier and thicker per, it's a huskier mushroom. So I just wanted to show you that. And they're a sign of a mature and healthy forest. There are a lot of mushrooms out there that are not good to eat, but they do have this symbiotic relationship with trees, and there's something of a succession to them. So when you have Ramarias, you have a mature forest that is doing well, underground, which is a big part of what makes a forest healthy. So they're good to see. It's not all about the can I eat this beautiful thing that I just found. Let me pause now, and I wanted to actually solicit some feedback from you. I'm thinking of, for my further talks, there aren't going to be many mushrooms up in winter. But I thought I could run a little course on how to identify mushrooms in general and show you mushrooms from around the world or elsewhere in the US. And I just was wondering how attractive that would be to you for other sessions in the winter. Is that, you can just throw up responses in the chat, or or you can also talk, that's fine. Are we're being shy. Okay, just think about it. Tell the T-Town people.
Please do let us know. I do see quite a few thumbs up.
Oh, okay. Good. Because what I'm trying to do a little bit here with the sharing screen again. So this is actually, here we go. There we go. So this is the Mushroom the Journal site. This is the homepage of the Mushroom the Journal site. Hunting boletes in Sardinia. You can download this free issue. It's the previous issue now. And we have, you know, mushroom identification, mycobiomes and eating, and then mushroom biology. And something that's a bit between mushroom biology and mushroom identification is what I try to give you when I'm talking to you about these mushrooms is something of a species concept. You know, mushrooms are these living, growing things. When they're babies, they look quite different from when they're mature or when they're old, kind of like us, but, you know, also all sorts of other organisms like butterflies. And, you know, what we have here is a picture of different stages in the life of this common lawn mushroom, which is called Conocybe lactea. It's named for being milk colored. So when it comes up on the left, this is an age progression from left to right. So when it comes up first, it's little, the cap is all curled up to protect the gills, which are where the spores are going to grow. It actually has a membrane covering the gills at first, and you can see it tearing away a little bit at this second mushroom. You can see there's like this jagged edge where there are little fragments of that covering, and then it expands, and the spores on this mushroom are dark brown. So as it matures and it produces more and more spores, the gills get colored dark brown from those spores. So you have, you know, you have a life overview of this mushroom. So if you have it in your field guide as one of these mushrooms in the middle, and what you find looks like something on either end, or, you know, anything like that, you know, a lot of field guides, they only have one photo. So it's very important to get a sense of what the whole life species concept is for the mushroom that you have, so that you can realize, you know, for one thing, that these are all the same thing, you know, very basically. But also, if you find something that looks like this, you can figure out from the information in your field guide what it is. And that's why we, for instance, we tell you to take a spore print. So this, again, this is the same mushroom at 3 stages in its development. It has these dark purple black spores, purplish brown, but they don't develop quite at first. So at first the gills are colored white and they darken gradually as the mushroom gets older. Now, we often tell you, you can read in your field guide to take a spore print where you take the mushroom's cap, you put it on a piece of avant-garde art in the morning, and it gives you the color of the spores in deposit. You know, this is an agaricus. You can get this chocolate brown color, that's what we call it, is characteristic of the genus Agaricus, which is the main genus of those mushrooms you get at the store, the portobellos, the button mushrooms. You know, when your portobellos get older, you'll see the gills turn this color. You can, and the thing is also, they're always producing spores, so you can get a nice spore print even when the gills are not really themselves very colored. the mushrooms will drop spores on neighboring mushrooms. So here, the left two mushrooms, one of them is dropping its spores on the lower mushroom. And so there's a spore deposit there. This mushroom here produces orange pumpkin colored spores, which are looking a little yellow in this photo, but they're all over the log and the leaves on all sides of it. So, you know, this is the kind of thing where you want to know what the mushroom is doing, what it's trying to do in the woods. You know, it's this living thing. It's trying to reproduce, and that governs so much, call it behavior, like as we saw with the Flammulina when they're grown in an enclosed area and they want to get out. You can find all sorts of mushrooms, you know, just like if you have, you know, weeds in your garden and they're coming out from under a rock, so they'll like, the stem will travel 2 feet in order to get out from under the rock and finally stick up in the middle of your tomatoes. You know, mushrooms that grow on wood will do that also, and for similar reasons. Not that they want to get sunlight to photosynthesize, but they want to get out into the open to release their spores. Now, the sort of mushroom that par in winter is, let's run this thing, are polypores. And these are these woody bracket fungi, they're called sometimes. They're hard. They are perennial. These layers that you see on the right here, especially in the big lower one, those are growth rings. And, you know, they're kind of like on a tree. And these things will come back each year and they'll just make a new layer of growth. And if you look, this cross section here, well, actually there are two cross sections on the bottom two pictures. They're growing these very long tubes inside. They produce their spores in the tubes, and they drop their spores out the ends of the tubes into the world for them to float away and form a new polypore. So if you look at the underside of these things, here in sort of the central left, you'll see a bunch of really tiny pores. They're really tiny. The cross section here on the lower left, you can thing where like each year they'll put on a new layer like trees do. Every time it rains and they get enough digested tree to do more work, they'll put out a new layer of pores, send a new crop of spores out into the world. So their strategy is like the jelly fungus, except they produce billions and billions of spores each time. But they also do the perennial thing, and they keep producing a new crop of spores each time it rains. Now, here's a close-up of the underside of one of these things. So there's just a tremendous number of very tiny pores in some of these. You see the scale is in millimeters. So this vertical scale, the vertical dimension here, which is 12 millimeters long, that's just about half an inch. So they've got all these spore-producing pores packed into this space to try and just be as efficient as possible. So a lot of these, if you just look at them casually, they'll look solid on the underside, just because these pores are so tiny. And you'll notice that also, the other thing about that is that these are sort of these are the geometric complement of those tooth fungi. So the tooth fungi, they're producing all those bristles, which, you know, could, if you match them up exactly and precisely, those could fit into all of these pores as if they were sockets. So they actually have the exact same surface area to produce their spores on. And this is a cross section showing those growth layers, that each time this thing comes out, it produces a new layer of pores, and it just adds on to the old one. This is one that you can find just about anywhere. It's in the genus Ganoderma. There are a whole bunch of different species of these. They're called varnish conchs sometimes. These really hard ones are called conchs because, you know, like you can knock on them with your hand and it'll sort of conch, make that sound. And these are a traditional ingredient in Chinese medicine, in traditional Chinese medicine. You can brew a tea with them. You can, I had a roommate in college from Taiwan whose father made a special cordial out of them where, you know, he just soaked them in booze for half a year or so and made this very special drink that, you know, had medicinal purposes, so it was okay to just drink it. We have, I don't know, about half a dozen species here. We did an article on them a few years back. It's very bitter when you decoct them. It's just stunningly bitter. If you're expecting a fun time with these, you will not have it. But you know, it's this thing that is done. Here is a different, this is sort of the other half of the genus Ganoderma. They're this much duller grayish brown color on top, and they have this bright white pore surface, and they're also white on the edge where they're growing. I mean, they're always white where they are growing. You can see on the edge here also. And the whole point of them is to grow their pores. So while they're still coming out, the whole underside is going to be white. And these dull ones are called artist conchs because on that underside, they're resinous. So if you sort of break the tissues, this resin will come out and stain them brown, and you can draw on them and make artwork, which is fairly permanent. This is actually a West Coast mushroom, but you can do all sorts of things like this, and it's kind of fun and cool. Different. You can see that it's not white on the underside, it's this sort of golden brown. And these, excuse me, are in the genus Felinus. There's another one also, but for the moment, we're going to call this Felinus. And the species on this is Ignarius, which comes from setting fires. And the other one, let's see if I included it. No, okay, we're going to talk about it. There's one that's called a horse's hoof, which looks more like, actually, I'll skip back to the very first one. This is the horse's hoof one. It's black on top, and it you know, it's very thick vertically and has this kind of profile. Just in indigenous cultures across the northern hemisphere for starting fires, because they're very good at just catching fire in the first place, and they burn very hot and very slowly, and you don't need to season them. So if you are stuck in the woods and it is cold and you are not going to make it to shelter or anything, and you need to build a fire, you can knock one of these things off the tree, strike a spark into it, and it will start burning. And it will be hot, and it can keep you warm, and it'll burn hot enough to dry out wood for you to, make a larger fire. So these are sort of incredibly important in these northern indigenous cultures. In Mongolia, they're actually kind of sacred. And Genghis Khan's local name is actually, he's named after one of these mushrooms. And one of the things that helps them do this is actually the pore structure, because once you can break into, if you break up into the pores and throw a spark in there, it'll start burning there, and it'll actually burn through the walls of the adjacent pores and suck air in through there. And, so it'll have this chimneying effect where it can draw air in and help itself burn better. So it works very well for this purpose. Now, I'm gonna stop sharing. Let's pause. And okay, are there any questions about some of these things? I see that Melinda had. Yes.
Do you have a preferred field guide that you suggest people use?
Not anymore. I actually gave a talk for the Katona Public Library a couple of weeks ago, and there's actually, I can go run and get it off my shelf, but the Audubon Guide has a lot of Eastern mushrooms, but it was issued in 1983, and we've sort of refined our understanding of what we have here a lot since then. When I started out, I had that book, and I had a book called Mushrooms Demystified, which is the book that I'd really want to show you, but it's so I've used it so much that the cover has disappeared. So it actually, wait.
Oh, and we have a copy here that somebody has in their hands as well.
Okay. So
thanks for that.
Gloria is showing us Mushrooms Demystified. Thank you, Gloria. Yeah, and what this book has that is really good are keys. It has, there are other books with really lousy keys, but this book has what we call keys, and they work very well for actually identifying things. So a key is basically a series of questions that are numbered. And, so question number 1 will be, is growing on wood? Yes, go to question 2. No, go to question 3. And it's basically a flow chart of how to identify your mushrooms. And before you even get to the keys, they usually have a more large scale key, which asks you the things that I showed. What kind of spore producing surface does it have? Is it a tooth fungus? Does it have pores underneath? Does it have gills? So that's usually your first line of attack. Then with gilled mushrooms especially, it's the spore color, which we covered a little bit this evening. And and then we move on to more detailed things. And you need stages like this because it's an incredibly detailed process. There are we have about 12,000 named mushrooms for North America. And so it's an order of magnitude larger than birds or mammals. um, and in any one, they have specific ecosystems. So in any one area, you're only going to have about 1,000, 1,500 species of mushrooms, but that's still like time and a half as many birds as there are in all of North America. So you do your identification process in stages where you narrow it down this way, you narrow it down the next step, and finally you get to a level of detail where you can use a more detailed key. And Mushrooms Demystified has very good keys for reaching your species. Now, it's a West Coast book. The author is from Santa Cruz, California, so the species he covers in the most detail are from Central California. But what he does is he's very good about keying out everything, and then quite a few of them, just you get to the end of the key and it gives you a name. And the way I started out back in my youth, I would go to Mushrooms Demystified, I would key it out, I would get a name, I would look up the name in the Audubon guide. And the Audubon guide would have a photo and it would have a description. And nowadays you can do better than that, and you can just Google the name online. And you'll get a whole bunch of different sites. We also have, I'm on a bunch of different mushroom identification forums on Facebook where, several of them have over 100,000 members. And they're actually quite good about getting your mushrooms identified just by posting pictures. It's sort of like iNaturalist, but a little better. And there's actually a dedicated website called Mushroom Observer, which is nothing but posting pictures of mushrooms and have people who really, really know what they're doing identifying them. And it's a little bit more involved to post your picture than it is on Mushroom Observer, than it is on iNaturalist. iNaturalist has funding, and they have like this slick app where you just take a picture with your phone and you pump it right into iNaturalist, and it takes all your geographical data. But Mushroom Observer, the identifications are much, much better. But uploading it, you have to like type in where you are and things like that. It's a little bit more of a pain. So we've strayed a little from the what field guides should you use question, but this is much more of what field guides do that you can get online now. I'm trying to develop my own app now, and we'll see how that goes. But in the meantime, there are all these other resources for you out there. I'm seeing a question from Leo that what insects or animals other than humans eat these fungi? And coincidentally, we can refer you right back to the, let me skip ahead in my little polypore talk here. Okay, so I will just do this. We're gonna share my screen again. Okay. So, come on. There we go. Oops. Okay, we want to skip all the funny stuff. Okay. So, when you've got these big monks eating the center of the tree, eventually a big storm comes along and knocks the tree down. And well, this is happening even before the tree gets knocked down. But you see these white fungal mats on the inside of the tree. They're eating the wood. And what we don't usually real think about, you know, um, when we first learn, um, we get we usually get told that, you know, there's this direct pipeline from the sun to plants, and then the plant, everything else eats the plants, and this is how the sun's energy enters our ecosystem, and you know, plants are so wonderful. And but the thing that they don't teach kids is that wood is pretty much nothing can eat wood except for fungi and a few bacteria. There are a few insects like termites that look like they're eating wood, but they things like bark beetles, they actually chew up the wood, they get their saliva all over it, and they have symbiotic fungi, and they get their spores on the chewed up wood, and the fungi start growing on the wood, and what the bark beetles eat are the mushrooms. And something similar happens like that with termites, except it's internal. They're sort of like cows, but except with wood. Um, Cows, you know, those four stomachs and that whole convoluted process. Yeah, those are fungi that are doing that, and some bacteria. So your first line of what eats this wood is okay. The mushroom, the fungi start growing. Then I'm just gonna come on. Yes, and then you get the slugs. So why does that have that? Okay. Um, yeah, and it's, you know, slugs. They're not just for mushrooms. They're not just for puffballs. This is a piggy slug, but they also they're eating those mycelial mats inside the tree, and um, these big conchs are actually a whole ecosystem internally of their own. This is a fungus beetle. And as you can see from those mandibles at the front end of it, it is a predator. And you can also see it's got this very slick surface to let it tunnel and slide through that tough mushroom more easily. And it's also got these pits all over it that collect spores so that it can go elsewhere in the tree and start a new fungal colony. And there are a whole bunch of these. They're sometimes called tiger beetles, or tiger beetle is one kind, but there are a lot of these. And there are other, this is the tiger beetle. This is a larva. This is a mere larva poised to strike. And there are other flies and stuff that this is a tiger beetle out on top of a different mushroom. If you've picked wild mushrooms, you know that there are maggots. Where there are herbivores, there are predators. And these tiger beetles, they burrow through these mushrooms, they tunnel around. There are centipedes that go through them, and they catch and eat the fly larvae that are inside of them. And I have a friend named Bill Ewell in Connecticut who takes a whole bunch of photos of these arthropods, and he's just more beetles attacking other beetles and mating on mushrooms and things like this. So yeah, mushrooms are a whole ecosystem, and there are all sorts of other things eating them besides us. We sometimes have this very human-centric concept of mushrooms being poisonous and why they're poisonous or not poisonous. And the truth is, most of those chemicals are directed towards bugs. You know, we have we have mushrooms fossilized in amber from, like, you know, millions of years before the dinosaurs, and they basically look exactly like the mushrooms we have today. This is a very long-lived and successful body plan and mode of ecology. So they were, you know, they were defending themselves from being eaten, you know, hundreds of millions of years before there were mammals. So they don't really care about us. They're really there for the bugs, which of course were really huge back then. So they have a lot of chemicals. A lot of the mushrooms you'll find, you know, if you've ever looked for king boletes, lovely mushroom, almost always tunneled, full of maggots, if it's at all warm. And then you'll find something that looks almost exactly the same. And you're like, oh, it's so beautiful. It's so perfect and pristine. And it's a Tylopolis. And they are just stunningly bitter. And they are so disappointing unless, you know, you're on a mushroom walk with the club and there's a new person and they're like, you can test for us whether this is a Tylopolis or not by eating this little tiny piece. Just put it into your mouth, and you know, if you're nice, you give them a candy afterwards to compensate for the horrible experience they had. But a lot of these chemicals that are nuisances to us are really toxic to little arthropods, and which is why the Tylopolis, they're pristine. No bugs touch them because they die. And a lot of the mushrooms that make us throw up are actually very, very toxic. They're just bad at making it from our digestive system into our bloodstream. But for insects, they don't have that fail-safe mechanism we have. And, you know, again, they just die. So we are omnivores. We have a really awesome digestive system that we generally do not appreciate. And we can handle all sorts of things that are really, really toxic to most other life forms on Earth, like herbs. All those chemicals in herbs, those are insecticides. Those are nasty chemicals that are really bad for most organisms. And we love them. And we've evolved to like them because they kill our worms. You know, we eat them and they're so toxic that they kill our parasites that are in our digestive system. And we're like, you know, at some point humans started surviving for longer and much happier and better because of that. So we just learned to love the herbs and the spices. But insects don't have our system. And so one of the things we have is a mechanism where if cells start dying in our digestive tract, we just expel everything in whatever direction is closest at the greatest possible velocity. So there are mushrooms that will do this to you. And there are these mushrooms called jack-o'-lanterns. They're bright orange, they glow in the dark. Never eat anything that glows in the dark. And David Aurora, in Mushrooms Demystified, calls them the sworn enemy of the large intestine. And about 10 years back, some biological researchers got the idea of, let's extract this toxin from the jack-o'-lanterns. And, you know, people do eat them. They eat them, they have this horrible purging experience, they go on with life. Someone said, okay, let's find out what those toxins are and let's bind them to something that seeks out cancer and try and make an anti-cancer drug out of it. And these chemicals turned out to be so toxic that they just killed everything. And, you know, the only thing that saves us basically is that we have this reflex that expels things really quickly if things go bad in our gut. And they had to go like 3 or 4 generations of finding ways to make these chemicals less toxic before they were safe to use as anti-cancer drugs, and now they are. But you know, we really dodge bullets all the time by our digestive system, and you know, we don't generally appreciate it. But if you go looking for mushrooms, you you will appreciate it at some point or another. So I'm seeing there's a question about what time of day do these mushrooms make most of their growth. Usually they come up overnight. They do most of their growth during the nighttime when it's basically when it's moist. They want, they have something called external digestion, where if they're feeding on dead wood, they want there to be free water in the environment, and they exude digestive enzymes. And these enzymes dissolve the wood, and then they sort of suck it back up and consume the nutrients. And that's how they eat. So they get most of their, you know, new feeding at night. They get most of their new energy to push up mushrooms at night. And just because it's moister, they when they want to fruit, when they want to make mushrooms, they make these little tiny mushrooms called primordia or pinheads. And it's basically all the cells that they're going to have in their mushroom, but like really small and squished together. And then when they get more rain and they get more nutrients, they just pump a lot of water into these pinheads, and they basically inflate them. And that's how you can have mushrooms coming up overnight. And you know, they're not, because they don't need to, the cells don't need to split or grow. They're just being inflated, and it's a fairly quick process. It's a fairly strong process. They've broken apart. You can find all sorts of pictures where they've broken up wood. They've come up through blacktop or concrete. But they do that at night just because it's moister. And you know, if you're doing this hydraulic kind of thing, it's just easier to do. Do we have other questions? And I see I also got a message. We love to learn about local things, what we're likely to find when we're out walking. And I take that to be an answer to my query about what would you like to see. And yeah, we can do more of that. And there are certainly loads of uses for polypores and historical background on them that we can talk about, that will enrich your walks in the winter with knowledge of what these organisms are and how they've been used by people in the past. This this slide that I had just gotten to here, come on. This guy on the left here is Ötzi, the Iceman, who was found in a reconstruction by the Swiss museum that is housing his remains and his artifacts. And he was wearing basically a utility belt, which you're seeing on the right here. It had some pockets, and it had some straps on it. And on the straps, there were some of these conchs, which you can see this black this lumpy black mass on the right. He had drilled holes in these conchs and was carrying them strung on this utility belt of his. And the black one that you're seeing here is a fire starting conch. So this is a, you know, this is a Stone Age technology that is still being used. And these pores, which you can actually find locally, they're these big hoof-shaped things that are white, and, you know, on birch, this very distinctive shape, and they're very kind of soft and corky. And we think they were used by him for deworming, because they're fairly toxic in that way. Yeah. Oh, here's a picture of starting a fire. So you drill down into the polypore and you throw a spark down there with flint and steel or something like that, and you end up with this chamber with your spark burning at the bottom of it, and meanwhile you've created a lot of this finely ground material that burns quite readily. And like I was saying, the pores on either side form chimneys that let the air reach your fire, and it's a whole thing. This is that powder with a spark thrown in the middle of it and holding it on moss, which is sort of the next stage. If you know this sort of being a fire in the wild, you start with tinder, something that'll burn readily and hot, and usually quite quickly, and then you get kindling that you put over it, and you know, slightly bigger sticks, and then you end up. So the tinder catches, the moss catches, and then you can use this to kindle thicker pieces of wood. And this is just a fire that was started with a big, and it starts burning, you know, and it's burning quite slowly. You see, it's pretty charred in the middle already and hasn't moved out that far from it. And you can see this is hot enough to boil water. So, yeah, polypores are your friend if you're in a survival situation in the wild. So I think that's about it for me. If we have, I think we still have a little time for more questions if people want to ask, but yeah.
One question that I have, which is just sort of general, is what is your favorite mushroom?
Well, that sort of depends on context, because, for instance, there are some mushrooms that are just completely adorable. You know, there's here we go. You know, this little thing. This is here we go. That's what we want. Yeah, I just think this thing is so adorable. We spend a lot of time talking about edibles, and that's, you know, just about everyone's was either edibles or drugs, you know, and I'm in the edibles category. But oh, you also can't really tell here, but these things are really tiny, and they're just completely adorable. So I love them. There were a couple of mycologists and
It seems, Leon, I don't know if you can hear me, but it seems like you might have frozen. I don't know if you get out of your screen sharing, if that'll help your internet catch up here. Well, while we see if Leon can catch up here, I just want to cycle back to the beginning when my computer shut off and I wasn't able to share all of his achievements with you all, but just to go over it briefly while he's coming back online. And not only has he been the editor of Mushroom, the Journal of Wild Mushrooming for nearly 2 decades, but his columns have also appeared in the Wild Foods Network, Backwoods Home Magazine, and Mycophile, the newsletter of the North American Mycological Association. And he is the former president of the Illinois Mycological Association. So he might have just got cut out here. We'll see if he jumps back in for the last few seconds, if anybody has any last questions. But I'm sure that we'll have him back here again, if not sometime soon. Here he is. One moment. All right. You're back in now. Can you hear us?
yes, I'm back.
All right. Wonderful.
Let me return to the screen sharing. Yeah, so another favorite of mine that is both cute and the chestnut bolete, which again, these are usually really small. They're about 1/4 across, but I don't know. Maybe it's because I found them a lot. These pictures aren't really doing it for me particularly. It's just
We might be having an issue with the internet here.
on Mushroom the Journal, actually.
There you are. Okay.
Let's see. There are these things called cup fungi, and there are some that are just shaggy and beautiful and just very cute. And yeah, Microstoma floccosa. And I think, does this have a better? No. Whoops. You know, they just, again, they have a life cycle. They're going to bear spores in the middle of these cups. So they come up as these little fuzzy toes, these little fuzzy pink toes. I mean, you know, what could be cuter? And they'll grow their stem and open up. And when they get all the way open, they start flipping spores out. And ooh. And just as I suggested to you, if you, whoops, why is this here? No, let's go to the Messiah site. And come on. Anyway, Greg has a whole bunch of nice pictures. And I've seen these once in the wild at a walk in Kansas. I went and gave a talk for the Kansas Club, and it was kind of a a twofer on life goal mushrooms to see in person. We found this, which apparently is not terribly common, not terribly rare there, though I've never seen it anywhere else. And I'm blanking on the name. And we also found this other mushroom, which again, I've never seen anywhere else, but it's not unusual there. And here we go. Rhodotus. Yeah, quite a thing to see in the wild. Live thing. And again, it has a life history. It comes out, you know, smooth and sort of tucked in. And then it gets older and it gets, you know, these lovely wrinkles, and it gets these colored drops on it. And then at the end, it gets kind of decrepit, and, you know, no one takes pictures of it then, but it does do that too. But, you know, so I got to see these two mushrooms on the same trip. So, like, win. And it was just the most wonderful experience. So, this is kind of what it looks like when I'm finding my favorite mushrooms. Yeah. So,
We do have one more question in the chat from Julie, who asks why it isn't possible to propagate or cultivate many of the species.
well, that depends how they receive their nutrition. Pretty much all the species that grow by eating wood or grass clippings or other, you know, dead plant stuff, you can cultivate any of those, and it can be kind of involved. The button mushrooms, the portobellos, those are the same species. It's actually kind of complicated because, as I sort of mentioned in passing a while back, there's actually a chain of succession. And the agaricus species, they want their wood or their grass clippings to be broken down for them first by other mushrooms. They're not a first colonizer. If you have a first colonizer, first generation that'll grow on wood, like oyster mushrooms, for example, they're just incredibly easy to grow. They'll grow on just about anything. People have grown oyster mushrooms on hay, on coffee grounds, on all sorts of random, you know, if it's a dead plant, they'll do it. What is difficult is the ones which, again, I mentioned in passing, are symbiotic with trees. So the main body of your fungus is what's called a mycelium. It looks like a network of these very fine white roots. And that's what either tunnels through the wood and eats it, and when it wants to reproduce, it sends up a mushroom, or it'll tunnel through the ground and it'll hook onto the roots of trees, and it'll be symbiotic with the trees. And trees, most plants get about a third of all their water from the fungi, and they'll get almost all of their minerals from fungi, and in return they'll send the fungus sugars, and, you know, both sides are happy. But so those fungi do not grow without their tree or without their other kind of plant. And they're, you know, so your porcini, your chanterelles, you know, basically your top wild edible mushrooms, they're all symbiotic with these trees, and they will not grow except in the presence of trees. Your truffles are also symbiotic. So naturally, there have been all kinds of efforts to create that kind of environment indoors, and they haven't really been successful. There was a Swedish guy about 10-15 years ago who was successfully he was growing pine seedlings in these little pots, and he was inoculating them with chanterelle mycelium, and he got like 2 or 3 chanterelles to grow in each little pot, but it was just not, you didn't get enough of a yield for it to be worthwhile to do as a business. You could conceivably do it at home as a hobby, but if you've ever gotten a mushroom block to grow at home, that's compressed sawdust or something like that, with maybe some, you know, nitrogen to make it more happy, and you've got a fungus in there. You've got it filled with mycelium. of a kind of mushroom that eats wood. So you can get, you know, oyster mushroom blocks, you can get shiitake blocks, you can get hericium blocks. You can, you know, if you look up pom pom mushroom, you'll find all these companies that make hericium blocks, and you can water them and get these, you know, these lovely white icicles all over, like I was showing at the beginning of the talk. But the ones that are symbiotic with trees, that's not an ecological relationship we've been able to recreate in, you know, at home or in a indoor environment. So there you go.
All right. Does anyone have any other questions for Leon while we have him here with us? Well, I know that's a lot of information, so I'm sure people will come up with them later when they review it. But I see a lot of thank yous coming through. I want to thank you, Leon, for sharing everything with us once again. And thank you to all of you for coming and joining us tonight. And I'd like to just remind everybody to come back in 2 weeks to watch Alyssa as she discusses tracks and traces with us once we hit winter a little bit more. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us.
Okay.
And have a good night.
Thank you all for coming out. Great chatting with you.